This is a man who's put American lives at risk for an awfully long time. And last night was the time that we needed to strike to make sure that this imminent attack that he was working actively was disrupted.
Iraq's weapons of mass destruction are controlled by a murderous tyrant who has already used chemical weapons to kill thousands of people. Facing clear evidence of peril, we cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Welcome back to AM Joy. Remember the early 2000s? Yeah, you remember. The American president and his administration insisted that after 9/11, we couldn't afford to wait for the threat of Iraq to become more imminent. We had to go to war because of weapons of mass destruction and even nukes, probably. Keep in mind, Iraq basically had no air force that could even reach us nearly 7,000 miles away, even if they did have nukes or WMDs, which of course they didn't. Remember that? Well, welcome to your deja vu. Donald Trump and his administration, without providing any real proof, wants you to believe that they just had to take out the top military leader in Iran, Qasem Soleimani, because he posed an imminent threat. And Trump knows that because the same intelligence community he has called liars and accused of plotting a coup against him proved it to him. Yeah, okay. Did they run that proof by Vladimir Putin first to make it believable to you, Mr. President? Meanwhile, unlike the Bush team, Team Trump isn't even bothering to do a misleading, lie-filled UN presentation. They just jumped right in with the drones. And over the past 24 hours, as this escalating mess unfolds, various prominent Iraq war supporters have stepped forward to bless us with their opinions of the raid. Former Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton, who, to be clear, has been jonesing for war with Iran since the Bush era, said, quote, "Hope this is the first step to regime change in Tehran." Perfect. Bolton is echoing a narrative that will sound familiar to those of you who are old enough to remember 2003, when we were told by our government that we were invading Iraq, a sovereign nation, to liberate them from their murderous dictator who was allegedly building a war chest of nuclear weapons and planning to wage a war on us at any minute. Oh, and don't forget the lying implication by the Bush administration that Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11, which he didn't. That helped make the war much more marketable. Pro tip, the Bush White House alumni might want to sit this one out because we all remember all of that. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but once we were done, there were American torture chambers and hundreds of thousands of dead Iraqi soldiers and dead Iraqis, period, tens of thousands of injured or dead American troops, and it turns out all for nothing, for a lie. And now we're stuck with a giant, enormous Iraq embassy, the largest U.S. embassy in the world, that is to be defended by this guy, the Bone Spurs guy. Perfect. Joining me now is Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan. She was one of only 23 senators who voted against the Iraq War in 2002, the right vote. Senator, what do you make of the fact that this president, who couldn't be bothered to fight in Vietnam because he had bone spurs, apparently, who claims he was against the Iraq War, which he called a stupid war, which he was for at the time, but he pretended he didn't, has now potentially launched us into a war without informing the Gang of Eight, but only telling his party friend and party guest, Lindsey Graham?
Well, Joy, first of all, it's always great to be with you, and I want to thank you for your really terrific work on an ongoing basis. And let me start by saying that General Soleimani was a bad guy, and there's nobody disagreeing with that. The question is, why now? And we know that because we've been tracking him for years, there have been other opportunities under the Obama administration, under President George W. Bush, where there were opportunities. He's not hiding. He wasn't hiding in a cave. He was out and doing things that obviously were bad, that we did not support, beyond the reach of Iran to militias around in the region. And certainly, I am very opposed to what he was doing. But the question really is, why now? And so we're going to go back this week, and I want to hear it. I mean, this president has to make a case that there was an imminent threat, not just say it. I mean, again, I was there with Iraq. I sat through every briefing. I was in Rumsfeld's conference room looking at video. I was one of those people that, well, we all did, took it very, very seriously, listened to everything. And it just didn't add up to me at the time. I didn't believe what they were saying. And so now we have a president who has even more problems with the truth, certainly very little credibility when it comes to these issues. And he's got a lot to explain to members of Congress. Why now? And then equally important, in fact, at this point, more important, what do we do next? What do we do next? I mean, he chose to get us out of the nuclear agreement with Iran and put us in a situation now where, rather than dealing with the biggest threat at the time, nuclear weapons in Iran, and doing it diplomatically with all of our partners, instead of doing that, we now are out of that. They are now back in the race, which is still the biggest threat, is nuclear weapons. And instead of having a process where we were dealing with that diplomatically and then could attack what they were doing on terrorism, which they've continued to do, no question about it, we now are in a situation where I believe this is incredibly dangerous for Americans, not only American soldiers, Americans in the region, but I think Americans wherever we are. And what is the plan?
Yeah.
There better be a plan that they've got at this point, because they've now put us in one of the most riskiest situations that we could be in as Americans.
You talked about having sat through all of the intelligence briefings before the war in Iraq. At any of those briefings, were you informed that Qasem Soleimani had anything to do with the 9/11 attacks? And I ask you that because Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States, has claimed that the late Mr. Soleimani, that he assisted in the clandestine travel to Afghanistan of 10 of the 12 terrorists who killed at the September 11 terrorist attacks in the United States. First of all, it wasn't 12 people, it's 15, and so he doesn't know that history. He's claiming that this man was a part somehow of 9/11. Is that true?
Joy, that's a new one on me. I have to tell you, I sat through briefing after briefing, read all the documents. That name never came up. And so it'll be interesting to see now how all of this unfolds. We know they're pretty reckless with the truth and with facts, and it'll be interesting to see going forward this week how they try to piece together some kind of a case. And I hope Republican colleagues will join with us in really looking at this and the serious threat. This is not a war game. You know, this is not a pretend situation. We have now put our country, the people of our country, our soldiers, our people, civilians around the world, in tremendous jeopardy with a country that does have the capacity, whether it's cyber attacks, whether it's attacking by sea, whether it's attacking on land. They have capacity to actually hurt and kill more Americans.
Yeah,
and so it's very serious, and I hope everybody will take it as very serious.
Yeah, and is the authorization to use military force that was passed after 9/11 and the authorization of military force that was used to allow the U.S. to justify going into Iraq, is that applicable to not only to Iran but to any individual in Iran? Can that be extended to this action?
You know, I can't imagine. I mean, my answer is no. Now, again, I'll listen this week to see what their case is for imminent threat and how they would piece that together. But, you know, I can't imagine that a credible case can be made for that. Congress needs to be involved. We actually are Article 1. Presidency is Article 2. 1 is before 2. And the fact is that Congress needs to be intimately involved and needs to authorize force, needs to authorize war. And so I'll listen. I always do. These are very serious things. I take them very seriously and will call them as I see them based on the evidence. But I can't imagine where they can make a case that this falls under the 2002 authorization.
Senator Debbie Stabenow, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time this morning. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And joining me now is Yasmin Basulian and Ayman Mohyeldin, co-anchors of First Look here on MSNBC. Nayyera Haq, former State Department senior advisor. Malcolm Nance, MSNBC contributor and author of The Plot to Betray America. And Naveed Jamali, Newsweek columnist and author of How to Catch a Russian Spy. Thank you all for being here. Yasmin, I'm going to go to you first because we were talking about this tweet by the vice president. Your thoughts on it? It appears maybe that he just fired off a tweet that he wasn't thinking much about, or that the preparation is being made to try to link this person to 9/11 as a justification after the fact.
There is a clear and obvious narrative, it seems, that's being built by the Trump administration. When you're seeing that tweet from the vice president, you're seeing him connect to the heart of what Americans think about, which is 9/11. That's poking at the emotional bear of Americans. You think about what you hear from National Security Advisor O'Brien yesterday, talking about why in which they pulled off this, what they believe was an imminent threat from intelligence that they had. And in fact, we see no evidence of that imminent threat as of yet. And when pressed on it, they basically said, well, we can talk about it, but saying that they're going to offer up the intelligence to prove that there was an imminent threat is not necessarily clear. You hear from Pompeo yesterday saying that there was a clear and imminent threat. You hear from the president himself trying to connect this to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and saying this is on the same level as killing Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is a stateless individual. Yeah. We know Soleimani was a government official in Iran. So there is a very clear narrative, you feel, that the president and the White House and the Trump administration is building for the American public to believe that this is on that same level, because they feel as if that is how they're going to get the American public behind them, to believe them without necessarily presenting the evidence and making it clear as to why they had to pull off this killing now. Because we know that they were tracking Soleimani for many, many years. Back in 2007, they were tracking Soleimani, and the general in charge there, Stanley McChrystal, basically wrote an essay about it and said, look, I didn't do it then because he was too big, and we knew the ramifications of this killing back then. We knew what would happen next.
He's part of the, I mean, well, let's unpack this a little bit more, because first of all, it's illogical to suggest that people who have no relation to one another, right, Al-Qaeda and the people would be connected within Iran, with Iranian militias, which are, they hate each other. Like, there's no, it just is just fundamentally illogical to try to connect the two. So that's absurd on its face. However, the same people, I'll come to you on this, Ayman, who've wanted to go to war with Iraq, the John Boltons of the world, at the time even wanted to extend that war and go to war in Iran. Like, there is an existing set of people who've wanted this for a long time. It alarms me when you start to hear people in this administration try to use 9/11 as a way to drag this country toward what a lot of people associated with Trump want anyway.
I mean, I think, first of all, it is a low point in American politics when you're exploiting 9/11 to achieve a policy objective that is totally manipulated. And let's be very clear, Mike Pence's tweet is factually wrong. Whether or not he did that unintentionally, I personally can't imagine that the Vice President of the United States sends out a tweet without having 5 or 6 people around him who are kind of debating with him, hey, is this a smart decision or not, and doing it. First of all, it's not 12 terrorists. There were 19 hijackers involved.
I haven't got that.
And among that, the actual 9/11 Commission report that was put out made it very clear. The reason why those hijackers transited through Iran to get to Afghanistan was because Iran had a policy of not stamping the passports of Saudi nationals. That's why they used that. So in the same way that some of our allies, like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, were exploited for 9/11 by the hijackers, so too was Iran. To come around now and try to say Iran was somehow complicit in 9/11 is the same as saying that the United Arab Emirates government or the Saudi Arabian government are also complicit in 9/11, which this administration has categorically rejected. So my issue with the Pence tweet is that it is a deliberate, misleading, misstating of the facts, a possible deliberate lie to lead Americans to believe once again that American military actions in the Middle East are justified. It's clearly
without the evidence.
Without the evidence. And it's clearly distressing to think that we haven't learned the lessons of 2003, that when our American politicians stand up and lie to the American public about weapons of mass destruction, lie to us about intelligence, come out and carry out an attack in a foreign sovereign nation, turn around and say there's an imminent attack, provide no evidence, provide no intelligence, and expect us all to believe it, we have a serious problem in this country where we have to start questioning, to what extent are we just going to allow these types of military operations to happen without any kind of accountability?
Right. I mean, and Malcolm, I want to get you in this, because here's the challenge with the sort of story that they're trying to tell us. We know that foreign governments have been implicated in the deaths of people in other countries, right? If that then is the justification for a military action against that country, you've had Russia, for instance, implicated in the deaths of people that it wanted, taken out in Britain, for instance. You've had the case where Jamal Khashoggi, who was an American resident, was killed, right? And there are lots of ways that this kind of a doctrine could be misused. You can't then say that then it's justified to take military action against a member of those governments in response. That is an insane kind of way to look at the world, right?
It is insane, and I'm going to tell you where one of the sources of this doctrine may have originated. In the intelligence community, we have this sort of funny acronym called TCCC, and it's called Tom Clancy Combat Concepts. That's when a civilian decision maker reads something in a Tom Clancy novel and tries to pass it off as the basis of a political decision. In the book Executive Orders by Tom Clancy with a president, Jack Ryan, he forms the Ryan Doctrine. The Ryan Doctrine was that world leaders or their commanders who support terrorism would be assassinated by the United States. Spoiler alert, that book ends with the CIA executing a Ayatollah at the end because of a terrorist attack in the book. Now, that's all fanciful until you start realizing the fact that many people on the conservative side really take these things seriously. And that it's identical to a fantasy novel of Tom Clancy. It may be coincidental, but for the most part, we are breaking international norms here. I am not supporting Iran. Qasem Soleimani, first time he ever came up on my intelligence radar was in 1986 where the IRGC was coordinating with Hezbollah and their terrorist groups who were kidnapping Western citizens, hijacking airplanes. I was practically living in that region of the world, and the IRGC was everywhere. But when he becomes the senior commander of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, a combination of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a vice president of the United States, and achieves a status that is so high that killing him would impact our policy to the point where it could injure or kill dozens, if not hundreds, of service members, then we don't do that. And the reason for that is you set a precedence that is closer to the Israeli targeted assassinations than the American deliberate intelligence-motivated activities that we do for holding other governments account. All it can do is lead to war.
Yeah. And the problem, among so many others, Nayyera, is Donald Trump and his administration, the people close around him, seem to have just done this on their own. There is no authorization to use military force that covers Iran or any Iranian official. There's the 2001 AUMF that was about 9/11. There's the 2002 authorization that had to do with Saddam Hussein's Iraq regime. There's the War Powers resolution that says that the president can only act without Congress in a national emergency following an attack. And then there's other authorizations that talk about funding, but not war. But there's nothing, and this is a member of Congress, Justin Amash, who was a Republican, pointing out that there actually is no legal authorization. Would Donald Trump have had to get any kind of authorization? Would he have had to go, for instance, to the Justice Department to get some legal backing to do something like this? Would there be any paperwork that he would have had to have? Is there any paper trail as to where he could have gotten the idea that it was legal to assassinate a member of a foreign government?
Well, this is part of the challenge we've seen, not just in the Bush administration, but the Obama administration as well, with the extension of war powers and executive authority to be able to call targeted strikes where we have U.S. forces. Congress has unfortunately ceded that authority for many years to the executive branch. And this is what we saw with Donald Trump do this week. That is a direct result of Congress not maintaining its authority over war powers and military authorization. I don't think that Pence's tweet was an accident. I think he's actually trying to connect and use American ignorance about radical Islamic terror and actually trying to connect somehow what was happening in Iran with what the 9/11 connection and to make it all fit under that original AUMF. I mean, let's be frank, that original AUMF from back in 2003, 2001 and 2003 have been used for all sorts of covert United States actions in all, parts of Africa, throughout the Middle East. It's the justification for our ever-expanding counterterrorism activity. You're also hearing Secretary of State Pompeo talk about liberation and how people are rallying in Iraq and Iran to be liberated. Those rallies are actually in favor of Soleimani's funeral, and in fact, they're talking about in Iraq right now retaliating against the U.S. So we're hearing the same narratives from decades ago now being used to try to convince an American public that is highly skeptical of war, but also highly ignorant of actually what happens in the Middle East and how things work there.
Right. I mean, you know, Naveed, you have people around Donald Trump who've wanted, you know, one might call them warmongers. You've had Lindsey Graham back in September. The U.S. should consider attacking Iranian oil facilities. It's now time for the U.S. to put on the table an attack on Iranian oil facilities if they continue their provocations or increase nuclear enrichment. Iran will not stop misbehaving until the consequences become more real, blah, 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 blah. Here's Ari Fleischer of the Bush administration, and here he is on Fox News on Friday.
I think it is entirely possible that this is going to be a catalyst inside Iran where the people celebrate this killing of Soleimani and puts pressure on the Iranian government to stop its terrorism, to stop supporting all the various terrorist movements it has around the world.
I mean, Naveed, they're all back. John Bolton. I mean, there's a case to be made that John Bolton now is finally friendly with Donald Trump again. He was mad at him and maybe going to testify against him. But you know, surprise, it's always Christmas at Trump's house. Now he's gotten what he's wanted since the early 2000s. I mean, this is insane, no?
Yeah, and I think there's a missing piece that I want to fill in here. We keep saying military action, and military action would, as you correctly point out, Joy, fall under the AUMF. And look, the military is in Iraq to primarily hit ISIS. There is another lever that would allow the president to conduct this action, and that is something called covert action. Covert action would require that the NSC, which has been gutted, presents a plan for specific policy activity, which is then reinforced by the DNI, who has only had the job since August. And it could be something as simple as saying, look, we believe that there is something here that justifies this course of action. The president can then approve that under covert action. His only requirement is that within 48 hours, he issues a presidential finding that clearly establishes that this activity was in the furtherance of U.S. identifiable U.S. foreign policy.
Before you go any further, Naveed, can such an action, this is not a member of some militia in Iran. This is a part of their government. That would be the equivalent of the head of the CIA in the United States. This is not just some militia. This is a part of their government.
That's exactly right. Nonetheless, that covert action is exactly how you could get this done. And that covert, because again, as you correctly pointed out, AUMF, War Powers Act, that's the military. There is unfortunately, and it pains me to say this, Joy, it really pains me to say this as someone who spent 13 years in the IC, this covert action lever, and as Nayyera pointed out, is something that could have been pulled, and frankly, I think it was. And it does only require a presidential finding within 48 hours. It can do everything from allow the CIA to carry this out and perhaps even participate with foreign powers who may have an interest in moving this forward as well. It is, and I think that, you know, when Congress reconvenes, I think that they have a duty to find out if, in fact, this was covert action and not under a military action, and I think that's a very important distinction. You know, you have other platforms besides just the military that have the physical ability to carry this out. And again, you know, look, that authority to use covert action, we've seen everything from the CIA in Afghanistan against the Soviets to bin Laden.
Amen.
And that is the mechanism that can be used here. It is the missing piece that I think, you know, we should start focusing on, that this was most likely, in my opinion, was not the Department of Defense. It was probably done under covert action, which would require essentially the IC. And it's a very, I don't want to say it's an informal process, but the process to get the president to approve this is incredibly simplified.
All right, so just very quickly, we're talking about the legality internally within the United States. That's very important. Let's not also ignore the legality from an international perspective, whether or not the United States legally has the right to carry out a strike against another state actor in a third party violating its foreign sovereignty under the guise of an imminent attack without providing any evidence. And that's important because even the United Nations Special Rapporteur, other human rights lawyers, lawyers and experts, international legal experts say if you are not demonstrating that the actual attack has neutralized the threat, an imminent attack is not met. You can't just say it's an imminent attack. Forget the evidence for a second. You got to provide that, but you can't just make the claim an imminent attack you have to demonstrate it has been neutralized. You have to demonstrate that the suicide bomber who was about to go in the subway has been shot dead, and so you save lives. You can't just say, like, oh, you decided to kill someone and not provide the evidence in international law.
Yeah.
You're violating bilateral security agreements we have with Iraq. You're violating international human rights law.
That's right.
You're violating all kinds of international laws, and that's why the Iranians are saying we are now going to try and pursue this in the international forum. Mohammad Zarif, the foreign minister, said that they're going to pursue all legal recourse to punish the United States for this. He's expected to come to the United States next week to meet at the United Nations, try to build that legal case. Obviously, we know the United States disregards international law in a lot of operations that it carries out, and it's likely it would be held accountable. But that part of the conversation is just as important as the one that Nayyera and everyone else is bringing, and Naveed is bringing up about the internal legal aspect.
And then retributive attacks are not legal, right? I mean,
I just quickly wanted to respond to what Ari Fleischer said as well, because I think we are missing something there with regards to that conversation, and that if the objective here of the administration was to have people in Iran pour into the streets and be happy about the killing and overthrow the regime and advocate for regime change, that is the exact opposite that has happened. We were closer to regime change on Friday than we're closer to regime change today. They are not celebrating necessarily the killing of Soleimani. They are not. They are unified. They are rallying behind the flag. They're nationalists. They're
patriotic. It's not like the United States has ever gone in and changed the government of Iran and decided who we wanted to rule them. I mean, that's never happened before. I'm sorry, Malcolm, I cut you off.
Oh, Joy, really quick.
Go ahead.
Unfortunately, I'm the only person on this panel who has ever been in combat with Iran and their proxies. 1983, Iran and Lebanon. In 1988, direct naval combat with the Iranian Navy. In 2004, proxy Shia militias in Iraq. These people have capability. We are fooling ourselves if we think that we can just do things and not understand the consequences of what a unified country of 85 million people who now have thousands of anti-ship missiles, hundreds of ballistic missiles, who can muster up a commando force between 300,000 and 1 million men in a matter of weeks and could savage every oil field and attack every facility we have in Iraq and the Eastern Arabian Sea or the Persian Gulf. If we ignore this and you start listening to the Lindsey Grahams and the John Boltons, you're going to get more than war. Because we're capable of handling a war, but we are not capable of losing ships. We are not capable of having that embassy turned into a fishbowl for thousands of rockets, which could pour down on it by the hundreds per hour. This is dangerous. And until we understand what we just did has the ability to kill way more American citizens than they claim to have protected, we are standing into danger.
And Nayyera, I'm going to give you the quick last word on this, because unlike in Iraq, where the Bush administration was able to bamboozle other countries to go along with the idea, this is just the U.S. Have you seen any indication that there is any other country in the world that is supportive of this action, or at least is willing to go forward and support it?
And in fact, the United States is actually alone in many things in dealing with Iran, in particular, pulling out of the Iran deal. The rest of the European partners are still engaged with Iran diplomatically and economically, and we're hoping that to maintain that kind of coordination to keep Iran as part of the international community. So the United States is out here on a limb alone, without any evidence that it's presented to its own public or to others outside, and frankly, regurgitating the same type of rhetoric we heard back in 2001 for reading into the Iraq War. They're literally just switching a letter from Q to N.
Yeah, I mean, but you're saying very quickly.
Very telling that the only country that has come out in support of this blanketly and supporting Trump and praising him,
Israel, the other country where the leader says he can't be prosecuted.
And he's also under a corruption indictment.
That's an under a corruption indictment, yeah. Sorry.
Very quickly, if this was covert action, that very well may mean that this was not just the United States acting in this. And I want to make that clear.
But we don't have any evidence of that. Yeah,
we don't have any evidence, but I'm just saying, theoretically, under the function of covert action, that would give the lever for someone else to come in and help.
Well, we will see. Hopefully, Congress will follow up on that. But I think that is very interesting, because we're almost alone, not completely. Ayman Mohyeldin, Yasmin Basuvian, Nayyera Haq, Malcolm Nance, Naveed Jamali. Thank you guys very much. And next up.